What's up guys, this is Kevin with Hound Brewing, and today we're brewing up one of my favorite styles of beer, Altbier, also known as a German amber lager or German amber ale. To kick this brew day off, we heat our strike water up to about 152 degrees Fahrenheit. This would be the temperature that we maintain for 60 minutes during the mash. So as soon as we get our mash temperature to about 152 degrees Fahrenheit, we go ahead and get the grains ready to be milled. For this recipe specifically, I use 62.6% Pilsner malt, 14.9% Vienna malt, 2.5% chocolate malt, 4.5% Caramunich 2, and 15.5% Munich 2. For anyone interested in brewing this recipe, the recipe is posted down below along with the water profile I used and the brewing salts that I added into the water prior to mashing. Well, it's almost mashing time, but before we do that, I always double check to make sure my grains are milled just how I need them. In the past, I've realized that either setting my mill to a finer setting or double milling my grains will give me the best efficiency and best numbers, especially when using the claw hammer boil in a bag system. While mashing in, I like to add the grains in increments while stirring to ensure that no dough balls form. By adding all the grains at once, you risk the chance of dough balls, which can negatively affect your mash. Eventually, I calmed down on my OCD. I realized that the mash is stirred in well enough and it's time to connect the hoses for recirculation. I'll run a hose from the kettle to the pump and from the pump to the lid, and this will be the system that I use to recirculate the wort for that 60 minutes of mash time. So now that we have the wort circulating, this becomes a waiting game, folks. Since I decided to wake up at 4:30 in the morning to brew, I'm going to sit back, relax, enjoy some coffee, and realize that I probably should have slept a little bit more. So about 10 minutes into the mash, we'll take a sample and check the pH level. Ideally, we're shooting between 5.3 to 5.5, but in these circumstances, we're around 5.9. With just a little bit of lactic acid and 10 more minutes of mash, we should be down to around the 5.5 range that we need. While checking the second sample 10 minutes after adding lactic acid, found that we're around 5.5, maybe 5.52, which is good enough for me, and we're going to keep it where it's at. With about 30 minutes left in the mash, I'll periodically check the temperature to make sure it stays within 152. Upon the completion of the mash, I'll take a small sample and check for the pre-boil gravity. With our OG gravity being estimated at about 1.052, our pre-boil gravity ended up being 1.047, so we're not too far off and I'm not mad at it. So after recirculating, I disconnect the pumps and I make sure that whatever remainder wort we have left in the pump gets back into the kettle before we strain the grains from the basket. During this point of the process, we place the basket above the kettle, that way the wort flows smoothly back in. This will take about 10 to 15 minutes. Due to using a full volume mash, we will not be sparging for this beer. As the wort continues to drain back into the kettle, I like to go ahead and get my controller set to boiling temps and go ahead and kick the heater on. So once you've finished draining the wort into the kettle and you've reached your total pre-boil volume, which in this case was 6.5 gallons of wort, I like to dump my grains into the bag and put them off to the side. What you do with your grains is your decision, and in this case I will feed them to my chickens. So back to the brewery, you'll realize around 207 to 209 that your kettle's going to start getting up to a decent boil. I've noticed this with the claw hammer system when using the neoprene jacket and keeping the lid on top. It'll take about 40 minutes to get to that boil, but around 209 is when you really start seeing it hit hard. Once we get to the boil, I added about 1.5 ounces of tradition hops, and I originally planned for them to be a 60-minute boil time. However, I forgot that this is a 90-minute boil for this brew, and I accidentally added these hops in for a 90-minute boil, which would probably result in a little more bitterness, but at the end of the day, it might not be bad for this style of beer. So after adding that first hop addition and ensuring that we have a rolling boil, I like to knock down the percentage on the PID controller down to about 80. This will prevent us from having any boilovers while we have the lid cracked on top of the kettle. So with my next hop addition not being for another 30 to 40 minutes, I like to make sure my fermenter is already sanitized, ready to go for when it's time to pitch the wort. Another step that I do is, while I'm still boiling, I like to connect my plate chiller. This would be used to cool down the wort at the end of the boiling process. Before I use the plate chiller, I like to spend the last 10 minutes of the boil circulating the wort through the chiller to properly sanitize it to ensure we don't have any infections at the end. For my second hop addition, I added 0.5 ounces of tradition hops and 0.5 ounces of Liberty hops, and those would be boiling for a total of 15 minutes. Additionally, I always add a Whirlfloc tab around the 10 minute to 15 minute mark, along with some YEAST nutrition blend. Now this is not necessary, but in my opinion, it's an extra bonus to make sure that you have a good, healthy fermentation with your yeast. Like I said, it's not necessary, but it's one thing that I always add. So with the last 10 minutes of boil, I go ahead and sanitize my plate chiller by running boiling wort through it for approximately 10 minutes. This will ensure that by the time the wort's cool enough to transfer to the fermenter, it's properly sanitized and don't risk any infections that might be caught up in the plate chiller. So after that 10-minute time, we go ahead and crank on the groundwater and let it start chilling. With this one, we're aiming to about 62 degrees Fahrenheit, so that might take a little bit. In the meantime, we crack a cold one open and relax. While we continue to wait, I like to get my fermenter properly set up and ready to go to throw the wort into the fermenter. I've been using Spike Flex fermenters for the past 2 years now and I have no complaints. The simplicity of the tri-clamp system along with the temp control system provided by Spike ensures that I keep my wort at a perfect temperature and don't have any issues during the fermentation process. What I love about homebrewing is everybody has their unique way of making things work. Where I live in Texas, it's about 90 to 100 degrees outside this time of year, and getting a wort temperature down to 62 degrees is damn near impossible using groundwater. At this time, I've reached 90 degrees and I go ahead and transfer the wort to my sanitized fermenter. From there, I'll attach my temp control system, run ice cold water through the coil until we reach a 62 degree Fahrenheit. And folks, one thing I can't harp on enough is anything you do with homebrewing, especially at this point in the stage, you have to make sure everything is properly sanitized. You can spend hours brewing and doing everything right, but at the end of the day, if your equipment's not properly sanitized, you risk running your whole batch of beer. So once connected to the temp control system, I pump ice cold water through the coil of my fermenter until we reach a solid 62 degrees Fahrenheit. This may take 5 to 10 minutes depending on how cold your water is before you start pumping it through the fermenter. So once we've reached our desired temperature, we've arrived at, in my opinion, the best part of the brew day, pitching the yeast. For this beer specifically, I decided to use the Wyeast German ale blend. Although I'm using an ale yeast, I'm probably going to ferment this beer at a lower temperature of 62 degrees in hopes to have more of a lager type profile. Ideally, what I'm looking for is something that's clean, crisp, with a good malt presence, but also assertive with hop bitterness. Upon pitching the yeast to our finished wort, we bring the fermenter inside, connect it to the temp control system in a bucket of ice cold water, and keep this fermenting at 62 degrees for 2 weeks until the beer is finished.